The day the world stood still, what really happened the moment Jesus died? Imagine you were there. The streets of Jerusalem are buzzing with tension. People are pushing through the crowds, whispering, arguing, staring up at the hill outside the city walls. A man, bruised, bloodied, barely clinging to life, hangs between two criminals on a Roman cross. Some mock him. Others watch in silence, their faces filled with grief, confusion, and fear. This is not an ordinary execution. You can feel it in the air. The midday sun is high, beating down relentlessly. The city continues its daily business, unaware that history is about to change forever. Then suddenly, it happens. The sky goes black. Not a passing cloud. Not a slow, creeping dusk. One moment, it's daylight. The next, total darkness. People stop in their tracks. They look up, shielding their eyes, trying to understand what they're witnessing. The once loud crowd is now silent, save for the distant murmurs of disbelief. Minutes pass. Then an hour. Then another. And just as suddenly as it began, the earth shakes beneath your feet. The tremor is violent. Buildings sway. Stones tumble from the walls. Cracks form in the streets. Screams fill the air as people stumble, clutching onto anything they can to steady themselves. Inside the temple, the most sacred place in all of Jerusalem, something unimaginable happens. A thick, towering curtain, so massive it takes dozens of men to move, rips in half from top to bottom. No one touched it. No human hands could have done this. And just when you think you've seen it all, something even more terrifying happens. Tombs burst open. The dead, people who were gone for years, come back to life. What you've just witnessed isn't a coincidence. It isn't a normal day. It is a moment unlike any other in human history. And whether you believe or not, one thing is undeniable, something extraordinary happened the moment Jesus died. But what exactly was it? And what did it mean? This is the story of 8 supernatural events that took place in the final moments of Jesus' crucifixion, events so powerful that even a hardened Roman soldier would be left trembling, whispering words no one expected to hear. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The first supernatural sign, darkness that defied science, an ominous shadow at noon. No one expected what happened next. It was noon, the brightest time of day, when the sun should have been at its highest point in the sky. But in an instant, the light disappeared. Not a gradual dimming. Not a passing storm. A sudden, overwhelming blackness swallowed the land. People froze where they stood. Merchants stopped selling their goods. Soldiers looked up in shock. The executioners, who had carried out countless crucifixions before, hesitated. Something was wrong. The darkness lasted for 3 hours. Not 3 minutes. Not 30 minutes. 3 full hours of total blackness. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this eerie phenomenon. Luke describes it this way: "And darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, for the sun stopped shining." Luke chapter 23, verses 44 and 45. But what could have caused it? Could it have been a solar eclipse? That's what some skeptics claim. But here's the problem. Could this have been a solar eclipse? To answer that, we need to understand something scientific. A solar eclipse occurs when the moon passes between the Earth and the Sun, blocking out sunlight. But there's one key issue: a solar eclipse can only happen during a new moon. Passover, the very day of Jesus' crucifixion, always falls on a full moon. That means a natural eclipse was impossible. And even if an eclipse had somehow occurred, they last for only a few minutes. Not 3 hours. Whatever caused this darkness, it wasn't an ordinary astronomical event. So what was it? The people in Jerusalem that day didn't have scientific explanations, but they knew what it meant. And they were terrified. Eyewitness accounts, a fearful darkness. This event wasn't just recorded in the Bible. Ancient historical sources, outside of Christian writings, also mention it. The Greek historian Thales, writing in the 2nd century, tried to explain it as an eclipse. But even later scholars found his explanation impossible. Another historian, Phlegon of Tralles, recorded that, in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was a great eclipse of the sun, greater than had ever been known before, and night came at the 6th hour of the day, so that even the stars appeared in the heavens. This is significant. He wasn't a Christian. He had no reason to support the gospel accounts. Yet he describes an unnatural darkness, one that lasted far longer than any known eclipse. Even Roman authorities noted something strange happened that day. Tertullian, an early Christian writer in the 2nd century, even challenged the skeptics of his time, saying, "That event, you yourselves have recorded in your archives." So let's recap. The Bible records it. Greek and Roman historians mention it. It could not have been an eclipse. But beyond the science, there was a deeper meaning behind the darkness. One that had been foretold centuries earlier. The symbolism of darkness in the Bible. This wasn't the first time supernatural darkness had fallen over the earth. In the Old Testament, darkness was often a sign of God's judgment. In the book of Exodus, when Pharaoh refused to free the Israelites, one of the 10 plagues was darkness covering Egypt for 3 days. The prophet Amos wrote, "On that day, declares the Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." Amos chapter 8, verse 9. A prophecy written 700 years before Jesus. The prophet Joel also foretold this event. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Joel chapter 2, verse 31. The people of Jerusalem would have known these scriptures. They would have understood that this was not a coincidence. This was a sign. A warning. Something divine had just happened. What did this darkness really mean? In that moment, as the sky blackened and the temperature dropped, Jesus cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. Some believe this was the weight of humanity's sin being placed upon him. Others see it as a moment of separation, where, for the first time, the Son felt the full distance from the Father. Whatever your belief, one thing is certain, the world had never seen a day like this before. And it wasn't done yet. Because in just a few moments, the next shocking event would take place. And it would shake Jerusalem to its very foundation. The second supernatural sign, the temple veil that tore into the sacred curtain that separated man from God. To understand why what happened next shocked Jerusalem to its core, we need to step inside the temple, the most sacred place in all of Jewish life. The Jewish temple was not just a building. It was the center of worship, the place where God's presence dwelled among his people. And at the heart of this temple stood a veil, a massive, towering curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place, also called the Holy of Holies. This wasn't an ordinary curtain. It was about 60 feet high, as tall as a modern 6-story building. It was 4 inches thick, so dense that it was nearly impossible to tear. It took dozens of priests just to move it for ceremonies. Behind this veil was the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in existence. It was believed to be where the presence of God himself dwelled on earth. No one was allowed to enter. Except for one man. The high priest. And even he could enter only once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people. If anyone else dared to step inside, they would die instantly. The message was clear, there was a barrier between God and man. And then, in an instant, it was gone. At the exact moment Jesus took his final breath on the cross, something unthinkable happened inside the temple. The massive veil, 60 feet tall, 4 inches thick, ripped in half. Not from bottom to top. Not by human hands. It tore from top to bottom. This meant only one thing. God himself had torn it. Can you imagine the scene? The priests inside the temple, going about their daily rituals, suddenly freeze as a loud, deafening RIP echoes through the chamber. They turn. Their eyes widen. The sacred veil that had stood for centuries, lies in 2 halves on the ground. The separation between God and man. Gone. This was no accident. This was a message. And the message was clear. Why was this so shocking? For thousands of years, the Jewish people understood that God was holy, so holy that direct access to him was impossible for sinful humanity. That's why they needed priests, sacrifices, rituals, to atone for their sins, to mediate between them and God. But now, the moment Jesus died, the old system was torn apart. The barrier that had separated man from God for generations was removed in an instant. For the first time in history, there was nothing standing between God and humanity. No more sacrifices. No more barriers. No more restrictions. God had opened the way, once and for all. The spiritual meaning of the torn veil. This was not just a dramatic event. It was a fulfillment of prophecy. Hundreds of years before, the prophet Isaiah wrote, "Your iniquities have separated you from your God, your sins have hidden his face from you." Isaiah chapter 59, verse 2. But Jesus had come to remove that separation. His death was the final sacrifice, the ultimate atonement. No more priests. No more yearly rituals. No more barriers. Through him, anyone could now approach God directly. The book of Hebrews later explains this perfectly. We have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, his body. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 and 20. Did you catch that? The veil was a symbol of Jesus himself. Just as the veil was torn, so was his body. And through that sacrifice, the door to God was thrown wide open. For the first time in history, people didn't need a priest, a temple, or a ritual to come before God. All they needed was Jesus. What does this mean for us today? That moment, when the veil tore, was the most powerful declaration of God's love the world had ever seen. It was as if God was saying, "You don't have to be afraid anymore. You don't have to be perfect to come to me. The way is open, come as you are." It was an invitation. An invitation that still stands to this day. Because the moment Jesus took his last breath, the separation between God and humanity ended. And the door to heaven was opened forever. Imagine standing in the crowded streets of Jerusalem. You've already seen the sky go black at noon, a deep, terrifying darkness that lasted for hours. You've heard the chilling rip of the massive temple veil, torn in 2 from top to bottom. And just when you think it's over, the earth itself begins to shake. At the very moment Jesus cries out his final words, "It is finished," a violent earthquake rips through the city. The ground quakes beneath the feet of Roman soldiers. Stones crash down from buildings. Walls crack. People scream, falling to the ground, clutching whatever they can for support. But this wasn't just a minor tremor. This earthquake was different. It struck only Jerusalem, centered at the exact place where Jesus was crucified. And it happened at the precise moment of his death. Coincidence? Or something far greater? Prophecy fulfilled, the earth shakes at God's presence. For centuries, the Jewish people had been taught that whenever God moved in power, the earth would tremble. The prophet Nahum wrote, "The mountains quake before him and the hills melt away, the earth trembles at his presence." Nahum chapter 1, verse 5. The book of Psalms declared, "The earth shook, the heavens poured down rain, before God, the one of Sinai, before God, the God of Israel." Psalm 68, verse 8. And the prophet Haggai even foretold a time when God would shake the heavens and the earth. "In a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come." Haggai chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. For the people of Jerusalem, this earthquake was no random event. It was a message. A sign that something earth-shattering had just taken place, both literally and spiritually. Can you imagine the chaos? Roman guards gripping their weapons, trying to steady themselves. Pharisees and temple priests stumbling as the ground beneath them shakes violently. Citizens running through the streets, screaming in fear. Some would have remembered the words of Jesus, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." John chapter 2, verse 19. Had they just witnessed the beginning of that prophecy coming true? The most chilling reaction came from a Roman centurion, the very soldier who had overseen Jesus' execution. He had mocked him. He had watched him suffer. He had seen many men die on a cross before. But never like this. And when he felt the ground quake beneath him, when he saw the darkness, when he heard Jesus cry out in his final moment, he whispered something no one expected to hear from a Roman soldier: "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Mark chapter 15, verse 39. Skeptics might ask, is there any historical evidence that this earthquake actually occurred? The answer: yes. Scientists and historians have studied seismic activity in ancient Israel, and there's strong evidence that a powerful earthquake struck Jerusalem right around the time of Jesus' crucifixion. The Gospel of Matthew records, at that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rock split, and the tombs broke open. Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 and 52. Ancient historians also mention a strange earthquake around this time. Thallus, a historian writing in the 2nd century, referred to an unusual darkness and earthquake during the reign of Tiberius, the emperor at the time of Jesus' death. Phlegon of Tralles, a Greek historian, wrote about an earthquake and a great darkness occurring during the same period. Josephus, a Jewish historian, also mentioned unusual seismic activity in Judea. Even modern geologists confirm evidence of an earthquake near Jerusalem around 33 AD, the very year believed to be the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Could it really be just a coincidence? Or was it a sign from God, a physical confirmation of the most significant event in history? What does this mean for us today? This wasn't just any earthquake. This was a supernatural event that marked the moment when everything changed. For centuries, the world had waited for a Messiah. For centuries, people had wondered, how will we know when God has moved? And in that moment, as the sky darkened, as the temple veil tore, as the very earth beneath their feet shook with power, there was no denying it. Something had happened. Something the world would never forget. And something that, even today, demands our attention. Because if the very earth reacted to the death of Jesus, what does that tell us about who he really was? The fourth supernatural sign, the tombs opened and the dead rose, an unimaginable sight. The dead walk among the living. The earth had just trembled beneath Jerusalem. The sky had gone dark for 3 hours. The veil in the temple had been torn in two, opening the way to God. And just when people thought they had seen it all, the tombs opened. And the dead, people long gone, buried for years, came back to life. This was not a metaphor. This was not a vision. This was real. Imagine you're standing in the city, already shaken by the earthquake, trying to make sense of everything. Then suddenly, you see familiar faces in the crowd. Faces you remember. Faces of people who had died years ago. Can you imagine the shock? The sheer terror? The disbelief? This was not just another strange event. This was a supernatural event unlike anything ever recorded in human history. But what really happened that day? And who were these people who rose from the grave? What does the Gospel of Matthew say? The Gospel of Matthew is the only biblical account that records this event in detail. Here's how he describes it. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 to 53. There are three key details in this passage that we need to break down. The tombs were opened at the moment of Jesus' death. The dead were raised but did not leave their tombs until after Jesus' resurrection. They appeared to many people in Jerusalem. This raises so many questions. Who were these people? How long had they been dead? What did they do after they appeared in Jerusalem? Did they eventually die again? Or did something even greater happen? Let's explore these mysteries. Matthew tells us they were holy people, or saints, who had died. But who exactly were they? The Bible doesn't give us their names, but many scholars believe they were righteous people from Israel's history, prophets, priests, or faithful followers of God. Recent believers who had trusted in Jesus before his death. Old Testament figures waiting for the promise of the Messiah to be fulfilled. Some even speculate that figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, or King David could have been among them. We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that they were recognized when they appeared in Jerusalem. People knew who they were. This means these weren't just ghosts or spirits. These were physical resurrections. Just like Jesus would rise 3 days later, these saints also walked out of their graves. What happened when they appeared? Try to picture the moment. The city is already in chaos. People are speaking in hushed voices, shaken by the earthquake and the darkness. And then, people who have been dead for years suddenly walk through the streets. Neighbors see old friends who had passed away long ago. Families see loved ones they thought they'd never see again. The panic. The awe. The shock. We don't know how long they stayed. We don't know what they said. We don't even know what happened to them after. Did they live for a time and then die again, like Lazarus? Or did they ascend into heaven after Jesus' resurrection, as a foreshadowing of what would one day happen to all believers? The Bible doesn't tell us. And that makes this one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of history. Why is this one of the most mysterious events in the Bible? Among all the supernatural signs that happened at Jesus' death, the darkness, the earthquake, the torn temple veil, this one remains the most debated. Even today, theologians, historians, and skeptics wrestle with it. Some try to explain it away, calling it symbolic, but Matthew presents it as a real, historical event. Others say it proves that Jesus' death had immediate power over death itself. And that's what makes this event so powerful. It was a preview of what was to come. A foreshadowing of the final resurrection. A confirmation that Jesus didn't just die, he conquered death. What does this mean for us today? This event raises a massive question. If this really happened, if people actually came back to life the moment Jesus died, then death itself was shaken to its core that day. The world had never seen anything like it before. And it hasn't since. But it was a sign. A message from God. That death was not the end. That the power of Jesus' sacrifice was stronger than the grave. And that one day, just like those saints, we, too, will rise again. The fifth supernatural sign, the Roman centurion's shocking confession. A hardened soldier faces the unexplainable. He had seen hundreds of crucifixions. He had heard countless men scream in agony, curse their fate, beg for mercy. To him, this was just another execution. Just another criminal. Another so-called king who had challenged Rome and paid the price. But now, something felt different. The sky had turned black at noon. The earth had trembled beneath his feet. Tombs had burst open. And the man on the cross, the one they had mocked, tortured, and nailed to a tree, had just cried out with a strength that no dying man should have had, "It is finished." Then, silence. A heavy, suffocating stillness. And in that moment, something shifted inside this hardened Roman soldier. He had come to Golgotha as an executioner. But he was about to leave as a believer. Who was this Roman centurion? The centurion was not just any soldier. In the Roman military, a centurion was a commander over 100 men, a seasoned warrior, respected for his skill, discipline, and unwavering loyalty to Rome. This particular centurion was likely stationed in Judea as part of the Roman forces tasked with maintaining order in this rebellious province. He had probably seen many so-called messiahs rise and fall. He had likely presided over dozens of crucifixions, if not more. To him, Jesus was just another troublemaker. But now, standing at the foot of the cross, watching this man die in a way no one had ever died before. He was shaken. And for the first time, he saw something he could not explain. As the earthquake settled, as the dust from the shattered rocks hung in the air, the centurion looked up at the lifeless body of Jesus. And the words escaped his lips before he could stop them, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Mark chapter 15, verse 39. This was a Roman soldier. A man sworn to Caesar, who was believed to be a god himself. And yet, in this moment, he wasn't looking at Rome. He wasn't looking at Caesar. He wasn't thinking about power or conquest. He was looking at a dead man on a cross. And realizing he was standing in the presence of something divine. The deep symbolism of his words, this confession, was earth-shattering, not just for the centurion, but for what it meant in the grand story of history. A Roman acknowledging a Jewish king. Rome had crucified Jesus as a criminal. Yet a Roman officer now called him the Son of God. This was not just a personal realization, it was a statement that shook the very foundation of Roman and Jewish authority. A foretaste of the gospel spreading to the nations. Up until this moment, only Jews had truly worshipped the God of Israel. But now, a Gentile, a Roman, was the first to proclaim Jesus as the Son of God at his death. This was a foreshadowing of what was to come, the gospel spreading beyond Israel, reaching the farthest corners of the world. The ultimate irony: the religious leaders mocked Jesus for claiming to be the Son of God. The soldiers laughed at him, placing a crown of thorns on his head, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And yet, in the end, it was one of those very soldiers who was the first to recognize the truth. What does this mean for us today? The centurion went to Golgotha to do a job. He left forever changed. He started the day as a Roman executioner. By the time Jesus took his final breath, he was the first witness to declare him the Son of God. This moment was a message to the world: even the hardest heart can be changed. Even the most unlikely person can see the truth. Even the greatest skeptic can come to believe. And if a Roman soldier, one of the very men responsible for Jesus' death, could recognize his divine identity, then what does that mean for us today? The final impact: what does this mean for us today? A moment that changed history forever. Over 2,000 years have passed since the day Jesus was crucified. And yet, that single day still shapes the world we live in today. Think about it. Our calendar is divided by his life, BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. His teachings transformed morality, influencing laws, justice, and human rights. His followers spread his message across every continent, through peace, not conquest. But beyond history books and religious debates, there's something deeper about that day. Something that still captures the hearts of millions. Because no matter how much time passes, these 8 supernatural events, the darkness, the earthquake, the torn veil, the risen dead, the Roman centurion's confession, still demand an answer. What really happened that day? And more importantly, why does it matter for you? Why do these events still shake the world? If Jesus had been just another religious teacher, his death would have been forgotten like so many others. If he had been just another revolutionary, his movement would have died with him. Instead, the world was shaken, literally. The barrier between God and man was removed. Death lost its grip, and resurrection became a reality. And that's why this story still matters. Because if these things are true, then Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. And if that's true, it changes everything. The unavoidable question, who was this man? Throughout history, people have tried to explain away what happened that day. Some say Jesus was just a wise teacher. Some say he was just a good man. Some say he was just a prophet. But there's a problem with those explanations. Jesus didn't leave those options open. He claimed to be the Son of God. He forgave sins as if he was God himself. And then, at the moment of his death, the world responded in ways no other death in history has ever caused. The sun stopped shining. The earth trembled. The temple barrier was destroyed. The dead came back to life. If these things really happened, then Jesus wasn't just a good man. He was exactly who he said he was. And if that's true, then every person on earth must decide what they will do with that truth. How these events changed the world. Whether you believe in Jesus or not, you cannot ignore the impact of his life and death. Human rights and justice, the idea that all people are equal before God, comes from his teachings. Compassion and charity, hospitals, orphanages, and aid organizations were built because of his example of caring for the poor and the sick. The value of forgiveness, he taught something revolutionary: love your enemies. Entire civilizations were shaped by his message. And yet, it all comes back to one moment. One cross. One death that, somehow, changed everything. What does this mean for you today? You weren't there when the sky turned black. You didn't feel the ground shake beneath your feet. You didn't see the dead walk the streets of Jerusalem. But today, you still face the same question that the Roman centurion asked himself that day: who was this man? Was he just a teacher? Or was he the Son of God? If he was just a teacher, then none of this matters. But if he was the Son of God, then everything changes. His death wasn't just the end of a life. It was the beginning of something greater. And his story is not over. Because according to his followers, according to the witnesses, according to the very prophecies that foretold his coming, he didn't stay in the grave. 3 days later, he rose again. And that changes everything.